The fastest growing Catholic movement in the West is not progressive. It is 500 years old. The assumption embedded in most analyses of Western religion is linear. Modernity advances, religious practice retreats, institutions soften their demands to remain relevant, and gradually dissolve into the background noise of secular culture. But the data from the last 2 decades does not support this as a universal law. A specific, documentable phenomenon is occurring inside Western Catholicism. A younger demographic, not elderly traditionalists preserving memory, but people in their 20s and 30s, is moving deliberately toward the strictest, most demanding expressions of Catholic practice available. They are choosing more Latin, not less, more silence, not less, more physical sacrifice, and more confrontation with a secular environment that finds the entire enterprise baffling. This is not nostalgia. Nostalgia requires memory. These people have none. What they have is a specific diagnosis of contemporary life that a culture offering maximum comfort and minimum obligation produces not freedom, but weightlessness. They are choosing weight. 7 forgotten traditions sit at the center of this recovery. They span the liturgical, the physical, the domestic, and the defiantly public. The first stones of that architecture are made of silence. A traditional Latin Mass in a stone church sounds like nothing most people under 40 have ever heard in a religious context. The priest faces the altar, not the congregation. His back is to the pews. The language is Latin, not translated, not explained, not made accessible. During the canon, the central prayer of consecration, he speaks in a voice so low it is inaudible beyond the first row. The congregation does not respond. They do not sing on cue. They kneel in silence while something occurs at the altar that the entire theological architecture of the Mass insists is not symbolic. This rite was the standard form of Catholic worship for 4 centuries before it was replaced in 1969. When Pope Benedict XVI restored free access to it in 2007 and Pope Francis subsequently restricted it in 2021, the restriction functioned, unintentionally, as a massive advertisement. It demonstrably accelerated interest among young Catholics who had never previously encountered it. Into that same silence, Gregorian chant returns, systematized between 590 and 604 AD. These a cappella chants were engineered acoustically for stone cathedrals. They do not translate to carpeted suburban worship spaces. They are not designed to be emotionally accessible. In a culture where every sonic environment is algorithmically optimized for engagement, music deliberately engineered to sound otherworldly functions as an act of refusal. The young women arriving at these masses frequently wear a mantilla, a lace veil covering the head. The obligation for women to veil was removed from canon law in 1983. Nobody compelled its return, but the theology behind it is precise. The Church veils what it considers sacred, the tabernacle, the chalice. The veil is not modesty in the conventional sense. It is a categorical statement about what the wearer believes she is in the presence of. They are choosing it, voluntarily. In 2026, these young Catholics are reconstructing the architecture of silence inside the Church, but traditional theology insists that the body must also participate, and that means reconstructing physical discomfort. The body in traditional Catholic theology is not a container for the soul. It is a participant in salvation. If the body participates, then what it does on a Friday afternoon, what it eats, what it denies itself, carries theological weight. Meatless Fridays were not historically a dietary preference. Abstinence from meat every Friday of the year was obligatory, tied explicitly to the day of the crucifixion. Friday was the day Christ's body was destroyed. The Catholic body, every Friday, registered that fact through physical deprivation. The institutional church relaxed this requirement incrementally in the late 20th century, allowing Catholics to choose their own Friday sacrifice. The result, documented honestly by the church itself, was that most chose nothing. But today, a growing faction within traditional communities is practicing year-round abstinence beyond any legal requirement, as a voluntary weekly mortification the institutional church no longer demands. Alongside this, Ember days are being excavated from calendars that most Catholics have never even seen. The Quatuor Tempora, 4 times annually, tied to seasonal transitions, mandated fasting and partial abstinence across the early and medieval church. Suppressed from the ordinary calendar in 1969, they survived intact only in the traditional Latin Mass calendar. A 24-year-old observing Ember days in a London apartment has no farm, no harvest, no seasonal labor connecting them to the logic that produced this calendar. They are choosing the discipline anyway, specifically because nothing in their environment requires it. That specificity is the point. Physical sacrifice happens in private. But this demographic is not content with staying hidden. They are pulling these traditions out of the shadows and taking them into the streets. On the feast of Corpus Christi, Catholics stop traffic, not metaphorically. The Corpus Christi procession moves through city streets, London, New York, Warsaw, Sydney, behind a priest carrying the consecrated Eucharist beneath a canopy, accompanied by incense, candles, and chant. Traffic halt, pedestrians stop. The procession does not accelerate to minimize disruption. It moves at the pace of a liturgical rite, because that is precisely what it is. The theology is transparent. If Catholics genuinely believe the consecrated host is the physical presence of Christ, then keeping that presence exclusively inside designated religious buildings reflects a compartmentalization the procession explicitly refuses. A procession stopping traffic on a London high street in 2026 is making a claim. It is asserting that the most secular square kilometre in one of the most secular cities in Western Europe is not exempt from the presence it is carrying. It is not asking permission from the surrounding culture. It is not adapting its pace, its language, or its incense to minimize offense. The surrounding culture finds this confusing. That confusion is, for the people in the procession, a feature rather than a problem. This public defiance is loud, but the final tradition this generation is recovering is quietly terrifying, and it happens behind closed doors. On the eve of Epiphany, January 5th, a priest opens the Rituale Romanum, codified in 1614. This book contains the complete catalogue of Catholic sacramental rites, blessings, exorcisms, and consecrations accumulated across 15 centuries. The ancient Epiphany water blessing it contains is not a gentle prayer of dedication. It opens with an explicit exorcism directed at the water itself. Exorcizo te, creatura aquae. I exorcise you, creature of water. The demonic is addressed directly, by name of function, and commanded to vacate. The 1970 revised rites softened this language significantly. The ancient rite did not soften anything. Families recovering this rite take the heavily blessed water home in small bottles. They mark the doorframes of their apartments with chalk, the initials of the Magi bracketing the current year. They move through their rooms, applying the Epiphany water to thresholds, windows, and corners. The theological logic is territorial. The home is a space requiring active spiritual fortification, not passive assumption of safety. In a 21st century apartment, this rite looks like what it is: an ancient exorcism protocol being performed in a room containing a laptop and a phone. The generation recovering these rites is not interested in accessibility. They are interested in the unambiguous acknowledgement that the domestic environment is contested territory, that the ancient church understood something about spiritual reality that a more comfortable modern institution chose to edit, and that the editing was a mistake. 7 traditions, no coordinating organization, no single theologian directing the recovery. A generation that inherited a stripped, accommodated, culturally apologetic version of Catholicism is systematically returning to retrieve what was set down. The strictness was never the problem. For them, it was always the point.